I'm Dustin Hoffmann of the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, and this is Brazil. Come along with me on this series as I tour some of the agricultural areas of Brazil, from Minas Gerais and Brasilia to Mato Grosso and Rio de Janeiro. I will show you the farms, industries, and the people that have forged Brazil into a large player in the global ag marketplace. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of a series chronicling my trip to the agricultural regions of Brazil. I'm Dustin Hoffmann, supervising editor and senior farm broadcaster with the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network. Earlier this year, I had the chance to tour the agricultural and urban areas of Brazil. This trip was made possible by the folks at Commstock Investments and Semntes Gaúcha, which we'll learn about in just a little bit. Of course, to understand any trip and really appreciate a trip to another country, you have to first understand the people, the culture, and the stories that they have to tell. And the best way for me was to immerse myself in it. However, I learned really quickly that I needed somebody that understood and spoke Portuguese a lot better than I did. On this tour, we got to see the farm areas of Mato Grosso and Minas Gerais. We saw the capital of Brasilia, and we also got to tour Rio de Janeiro. It was a great time and a lot to be seen. Of course, to understand the people, let me first introduce you to our hosts of the tour. They were Matt Kruse, an Iowa farm kid who ended up making his way down to Brazil before he even finished college, and his wife, Caroline Seibt-Kruse, who was born and raised on the family farm about an hour from Patos de Minas in Minas Gerais. She tells us about the history of their farm, Semntes Gaúcha.
I'm from Patos de Minas, Minas Gerais, is a state located in the southeast of Brazil. I am a third-generation farmer. I'm also a business administrator, director, and co-owner of a diversified farmland operation, which is called Semntes Gaúcha. The core business of the company is soybean seeds. We also diversify in corn, coffee, dairy, and beef cattle. Semntes Gaúcha has been in the market for 46 years. I have two brothers, Alexandre and Felipe. Both of them are agronomists, and today we lead and manage the whole farm operation together. We want to continue expand and grow our company, build on my father's brilliant legacy, and we really value adopting sustainability practices and the new technology. Parents migrated from Rio Grande do Sul, which is the state in the south of Brazil, in 1976. And at that time, there is no crop farming at the place where they bought the lands. There is no infrastructure, no electricity, and the conditions of the road were really bad. So it was very, very hard in the beginning. They worked really hard, but I think my dad was such a brave and visionary person to start and take this opportunity, this amazing opportunity to develop this land and start to produce.
The story that I always found was interesting. You know, your father told a story after the first year about how you guys would come together with some of his friends, and they considered giving up because it was so hard. And I think people take that for granted today, you know, that it was so challenging to get started. And so they, even after the first year there, they, you know, said, is this worth it? You know, should we just go back home? But they decided, no, let's try it one more year. And so they stuck it out and they persisted, and the rest is history. So I also like the story about, you know, they had such simple living in the beginning that, I mean, they were living in tents, they were living under black plastic, you know, as rain cover in the beginning. I mean, there wasn't any infrastructure at all. I mean, they had to build their own internal service roads. They were using, they were taking a water wagon down the river to pump that with water. and bring it back to the farmstead, and that was their source of water for a long time on the farmstead.
Yeah, as he said, this was a very tough in the beginning, very challenging. I'm sure he had to, face lots of problems and challenges. But when you follow your dreams, I think when you have the courage and he was so brave that he didn't give up and continue to follow what he was vision and expected to as he is today. He was very passionate about agriculture, and he always believed in diversifying crops. For example, if one crop didn't go well, you have another type of crop that could be as well as the other one. So I think
he was a big believer in diversification. Yeah. He didn't just focus on having the biggest grain farm, So that's why he got into the coffee and got into the dairy and the beef cattle.
So if you have a year where, unfortunately, you've seen in the last couple of years where it's been drought, just like up here, if the crops aren't as good, you've got the dairy, you've still got the beef, you've still got something to fall back on.
Something out of those 4 or 5 things should still be okay.
Yeah, my parents are from Rio Grande do Sul, which is in the south of Brazil, and people from Rio Grande do Sul, they called as gaúchos, so it means like cowboy people. So that's why when he moved to Minas Gerais, where these lands were located, he thought, I'm going to name the company as Semntes Gaúcha, Gaúcha Seeds. I think it's because of the tradition of the state, and also he want to keep the name, like, as people from Rio Grande do Sul are very, traditional and brave and really honor where they come from. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's why he was a interesting name to keep their tradition of the family.
And obviously her husband, Matthew Kruse, has a different story about how he went from the farms of northwest Iowa to the farms of central Brazil.
I ended up in Brazil really because of my father. So we have a commodity brokerage business called Commstock Investments, and I was in college still at the time. I hadn't yet graduated, and my father called me up and said, "Hey, let's go down to Brazil, check it out," because we were hearing all these stories about the growth going on down there, and it was really big in the ag media, especially, I think, and all the growth that we were hearing about. So we just went on a tour, our own tour, and was focused more on investing. Wasn't like a touristy type tour, but looking at actually buying land, and that was in December of 2001. It was my first time in Brazil, and so we're blown away by it. These huge tracts of land, it seemed really cheap, compared to what we're used to back home, and so we just looked for ways to get involved with it. So we eventually built an LLC and pooled capital together with investment capital, and bought farmland. And so I moved there. I probably made my permanent move back in 2004, and so I lived there actually full time. Boots on the ground. Lived there for close to 14 years, more or less, in Brazil on the frontier.
Matthew also tells a story about a family he has come to know and about how things worked when they first tried to establish a farm after moving from the United States.
Today, we all recognize the land as having value, productive value, but that was not the case. The common mindset at that time was this land is completely worthless. No one wanted to live out there. So much of Brazil was populated right along the eastern coast. There wasn't that, very few percent of the population was living internally within the country, and so there was a family that migrated from Kansas originally, and they came to upon this place where I lived in Bahia in the frontier of Brazil, and they got there probably a little bit too early. I want to say they arrived in probably the mid 70s, and they went to the capital at that time and asked, "How can I own this land?" And they said that the people in the government office literally laughed at them and said, "Nobody wants that. You just go there and you put a fence around it, and it's yours." And so that's what they did. They fenced 100,000 acres of land, and that effectively, possession gave them, ownership to that land.
The Brazilian culture is something that is different, but not altogether strange to a citizen of the United States. In fact, the fact that I said citizen of the United States is one of those things you don't expect to encounter. I heard from a few Brazilians that I met that even though much of the world associates American as people from the United States, they're proud to be Americans as well. However, it's just that their America is in the South. It never seemed to be a point of contention by any means. It was just that they took pride in the fact that the Western Hemisphere is all American. Carol talks a little bit about the Brazilian culture and the people that make up South America's largest country.
Brazil is a very diverse country, and our people is a very happy, friendly, outgoing people. It's a fun country to visit. It's also a very professional and hard work people that, work in different fields in Brazil, like agriculture, tourism, industry. You have a very large niche that you can, see what people really do in Brazil. Brazil is a very well-known country for the richest of agriculture in the world. We have, we are a leader of producing soybean seeds. We are the first big exporting and producing of soybean seeds in the world. We are also famous for producing coffee, corn, cotton, sugar, dairy, beef cattle. I think Brazil has lots of natural resources that continue to help feeding the world.
One thing you need to understand when we talk about the diverse regions of the country of Brazil is its sheer size. If you were to lay Brazil over the North American continent and line up its western border along our Pacific coastline, you can see that it's a landmass that can cover all of the national capitals of Ottawa, Canada, Washington, D.C., and Mexico City. It is that size that helps lend to the diversity of the country and its people. The one thing I did notice that they all have in common in different regions is how welcoming they are to their country. If you conduct yourself in a way that's courteous, gracious, and kind, you can find that returned to you. They're very happy to show you all the things that Brazil has to offer, and they want you to have a good time when you're with them. Celebrations can be planned or even spontaneous, as the people really like to focus on enjoying this journey called life. Also, did I mention the food? I wish you could smell and taste through these images I'm about to share, but you're going to have to settle for being teased with the deliciousness of the Brazilian cuisine. Things have really changed and grown rather rapidly for the Brazilians and their agriculture industry. In a span of a little more than one generation, they have gone from very few farms producing cash crops to becoming one of the agricultural powerhouses of the world. Matt Kruse reflects on what changes he has witnessed in just a short span of time.
So, in the 20 plus years since I first went down there, a lot has changed. When I first went there, Brazil was producing like 35 million metric tons a year, and now they're set to produce like 150 million metric tons. So looking at like 500% production growth in their soybeans in that 20-year period. But in terms of the technology, it's been impressive. They're constantly adopting larger, newer equipment. I mean, they pretty much have access to virtually everything that a typical American farmer would here. When I first went there, it was not uncommon to see cabless tractors or even cabless grain combines working in the field. And that kind of took us back a little bit, but that didn't last much longer. I mean, within a few years, I mean, that kind of went away, and I think probably the equipment companies even quit offering that as an option. But I remember, realizing that the farmers that had the equipment with the cabs kind of got first pick at some of the better employees, and because they of course all want to work in a cab rather than one without. So
now, of course, you can't talk about farming operations in any country without talking about government involvement. Now, in the United States, we've come to expect legislation such as the Farm Bill and other regulations that are put in place to help us both grow and support the agriculture industry in our country. However, in Brazil, it's a little bit different story. Matthew talks about the government and their involvement in Brazil's agriculture.
Well, I think there is, as a general statement, there is a lot of bureaucracy in Brazil, and so certainly the government, is very involved in what's going on in the agriculture industry in Brazil. There's an institution there called Embrapa, which I suppose is a little bit similar to the USDA, but it's more like their research and agronomic research institution for Brazil. So they've helped develop a lot of varieties, and they're probably one of the groups responsible for unlocking the frontier, in the sense that they discovered that in their research, this is like back in the 60s, that by applying lime to the soils, which were considered worthless back then, that they could reduce the acidity in the soil and make it productive. And so, that was a government research institute that, I think had a big hand in kind of developing, Brazil. And so since then, I think a lot of the fertilizer and global seed companies have kind of taken it from there and have done a lot of work developing that. But
also, when we think about getting into our fields to start another planting season, we think about how we operate those farms. We think of operating loans to help us plan for the year ahead and make it through to the harvest. However, in Brazil, these types of financing are not easy to obtain. And also, if you're still working on developing your land for operation, startup loans are non-existent. Everything's done with the proceeds from previous years.
That's one of the big differences between farming in the United States and Brazil, is just a lack of liquidity, lack of financing in Brazil. It's here we're used to getting our 30-year farm mortgages. As long as you have a good balance sheet, you're probably going to get your operating loan from your local lender. And in Brazil, it's just so much slower, a lot more bureaucratic. There are loans that exist for operating to plant soybeans, but as far as buying property and developing that property, there really isn't any lending that exists. And so you think about all the growth that's happened in Brazil, and the fact that all that growth has happened without 30-year farm mortgages, without lending to buy lime and phosphate, things like that, to develop the property. It's really impressive what they've done without that. And so, I know properties that they owned a big piece of property, but they developed it over 20 years. They didn't just, people would say, well, why haven't you planted this yet? Well, it could cost, I don't know about 20 years ago, but today it might cost $1,000 an acre. Well, the farms aren't 80 acres, they're 8,000 or 18,000. And so you take $1,000 an acre times 8,000. I mean, it's a big check, and there's no financing for it. So they're paying for this out of pocket, is what I'm saying. And so that's why a lot of them are opening the farms progressively over the years, just as cash flow allows.
Something else that I found really interesting was how we tend to hear the stories about truck strikes in Brazil every so often. I admit that before I came to the country, I just thought to myself that then they should use the trains and the rivers if the truckers don't want to work. I couldn't fathom how a trucker strike could bring an entire country to its knees. As I spent time in Brazil, I quickly learned how important trucks are to the Brazilian way of life. The Amazon is the main river that could be used for shipping, but that's far away in the rainforests. However, to get to the seaports in the south, it's a 10-hour journey from places like Minas Gerais. It's the only option they have because there aren't very many rails. There's roughly only about 19,000 miles of railroad track in Brazil. Compare that to the United States, where we have an estimated 140,000 miles of track. So why don't they have more railroad tracks? Well, the simple answer I was able to find is that the truckers' union in Brazil has the lobbying power that the oil industry has in the United States. It's necessary for the economy to run, but they have far too much bureaucratic influence. Matthew talks a little bit about how some of the truck strikes go and how the people feel about the situation when they happen.
Everything is trucked. They don't have that option to float it down the Mississippi River, at least when the river has water. They don't have the railroad infrastructure that we have. And so everything is highly dependent on trucks, which in one sense isn't necessarily bad, but it makes the country extremely sensitive or risk averse to those trucks. And so those truck drivers kind of know this, and so they have a pretty strong lobby. And so usually once, maybe twice a year, you hear about some truck strike. They're unhappy about something. The price of fuel went up, and it just seemed like things stopped for a while. And I think there was a pretty bad one in 2018 when so you hear these truck strikes happen so often. They start to seem to fall together a little bit and kind of be annoying. But it's like, oh, there's another truck strike, I guess. But there was a bad one in 2018. And I remember that the country for a while seemed to rally behind them. And, like they really wanted the truck drivers to get what they were asking for. And that lasted less than a week because between 3 and 5 days, grocery stores started running out of food and hospitals started running out of medical supplies. And then the general population was like, okay, guys, come on now. You made your point. Let's get back to work. And it kind of exposed how dependent they are on the trucks and the roadways. There's no other way to ship stuff. And so unfortunately, I don't see that changing anytime soon. It's just the way it is there.
So there it is, everybody. Just a little bit about the background of the people and the places that I got a chance to see in Brazil, and they'll serve as the base for the stories we're going to tell in this upcoming series. Now, of course, I only began to scratch the surface. I could only hope to really convey the full experience I had when I was traveling around in Brazil. If you get the chance to go, I always highly encourage you to take that opportunity. We'll continue to talk about my trip over the next series of episodes. I hope you'll come along for the ride and enjoy everything it is I got to see about Brazil. Until next time, I'm Dustin Hoffmann. Coming up in our next episode, I go to the Seibt family dairy farm and we talk about the work they are doing to become one of the leading operations in the country, all while being environmentally innovative and responsible. Join us next time from Brazil on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network.